Okay, so we're gonna talk about adaptation. We've kind of jumped around the different chapters, right? But the order that we've jumped around from phylogenetics to speciation to adaptation is kind of an order. The book doesn't use that order, but it's an order I like because it kind of goes from okay. Here's the history, the evolutionary tree of life, the evolutionary history. How do those separations of the lineages occur? So you go from the tree to the speciation, and now within the speciation we're saying, okay, and we talked about some mechanisms by which they occur, but then also within that, right, within those species, we see adaptation, right? We see organisms that seem to be remarkably adapted or engineered to do what they're doing in their environment, right? And this is something have noticed for a long time. Organisms just seem to be really adapted for their particular environment in an amazing way. And for a long time, we were in awe. I mean, I guess we still are in awe with that, right? But for a long time, this was a question, why or where do these adaptations come from? Organisms, the sort of first experience of observing wildlife and things out in nature is that they appear to be designed specifically to do that function that they're doing in the environment, right? There's lots and lots of different examples of it. You can watch TV documentaries, and there's just tons and tons of examples. And so historically, different people have written about it, have hypothesized, opined over it. One was Cicero in the 1st century BCE. He was a Roman writer, statesman. He used the concept of this natural design to challenge some of the other philosophers of the day, but basically saying that there is design in nature and this design comes from somewhere. This eventually sort of formed what we call natural theology. This was an attempt to know sort of the creator, know God, right? And God's hypothesize or sort of extrapolate through observing nature, God's relationship to the world. Okay, and so you would go out. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Darwin and the country parson. They would go throughout the week, go observe nature, try to understand the characteristics of the deity through observing the creation. This is what we know as natural theology. So here we'll touch on. We kind of talked about it when we had the PowerPoint on Darwin. Okay, so natural theology explains the properties of nature, including adaptations, as sort of this veneration of the deity. One of the early writers was a guy by the name of John Ray. Here's a quote from John Ray: "There is for a free man no occupation more worthy and delightful than to contemplate the beauteous works of nature and honor the infinite wisdom and goodness of God." So this was a very, very common thing. This is Darwin mentioned several times the writings of John Ray. Not only the writings of John Ray, but then also the writings of another guy who is well known as a natural theologian, and that is William Paley. And I believe we've discussed William Paley a little bit before. But Darwin. William Paley is probably most famous now in sort of modern times as the author of the watch metaphor, right? In looking at adaptations in nature, Paley said basically, if you were to just be walking along, right, you're on the beach or you're on the heath, I think that's what he said, you're walking along the heath in England, and you stub your toe on a watch. Because of the complexity of a watch, that you instantly wouldn't think, oh, this randomly assembled, right? You would think, okay, because of this complexity, there had to have been a designer for this complex structure, especially when you look at all of the different parts. Here he says that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are or placed after another manner, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. The inference we think is inevitable that the watch must have had a maker, because you have all of these different parts of the watch working in unison to accomplish the single function of telling time. Okay, this is the watchmaking metaphor. One of the earlier books, nobody selected to read this book, but Richard Dawkins, who's kind of a popular, well-known evolutionary biologist, one of his original books, and this was actually the book that I had to read way back in the day when I took evolution, and it was called The Blind Watchmaker. So he was taking this metaphor and then saying and explaining how through natural selection, through evolution, that you could actually have a blind watchmaker in the sense of blind mutation, selecting for these different mutations to create the watch. And so this is a pretty famous metaphor. It originated in William Paley. Darwin mentions that William Paley's writings were as influential writings in his early life as anybody else. Right? It was pre sort of the separation of nature. Nature was many of the people that were out there and really at nature and really observing nature were the people that were out there and doing it for sort of theological, religious reasons, right? Then you had, then you had the separation later on where they said, oh, okay, maybe it isn't, maybe we can explain some of these things in sort of more natural terms. So that's adaptation. Paley, just as I was saying, very, very influential with Charles Darwin. Here's a quote from Darwin. You can read that on your own time. But Darwin then, kind of broke from this tradition and said, okay, we're not just going to evoke a designer for, creating these adaptations, but we're going to look for natural selection. He came up with this process of natural selection and then argued that it could sort of intervene in place of that benevolent designer. But Darwin struggled with this. We talked about the complexity, the irreducible complexity of the eye. This is one of the issues that Darwin struggled with throughout his life. This was sort of the first sort of quote unquote irreducibly complex structure, right? That scientists were thinking, okay, this is a very complex structure. Here in a slide or two, there's a quote that says, what good is it to have 10% of an eye, right? And so that we've already kind of discussed this, and most of your books that you're reading probably discuss that too. But if we look at just adaptation itself, right, we see that also throughout the history there have been various people that have proposed mechanisms for organisms becoming adapted to their environment. So Lamarck, we've talked about Lamarck before. He's a French guy, most famous for his proposal of this notion of use and disuse, or of acquired characteristics. And so the classic example is he said, okay, historically giraffes, they're all the way on the left, farthest back in time, had short necks, and then as giraffes stretched their necks and reached up to the trees, right, higher and higher trees, by stretching all the time, they then elongated their necks and then passed that elongated neck down to the next generation and next generation and next generation. So this is sort of what Lamarck was famous for. Sometimes we don't give him enough credit for being a person that sort of predated Darwin in trying to at least propose a mechanism for evolution. But in our discussion in this chapter, we can look at Lamarck as one of the earliest people that was trying to figure out how things became adapted, or how adaptations formed, outside of just kind of saying, oh, they were designed by a deity to fit that exact function. Okay. Next here in a little bit. Okay. So, not only are organisms well adapted for their environment, but they often possess really, really complex adaptations. And we've already talked about co-adaptations, right? We've already talked about functional intermediates. And so, with the case of the eye, and we'll again address the eye, but we looked at functional intermediates of not just, there are in between situations when maybe you can't have, the really great vision, that vertebrates have, right, or tetrapods have, but there are intermediate stages, or that an octopus has, but there are intermediate stages of being able to sense light, and there could be a benefit, especially if you're a marine organism, of sensing light because it gives an orientation to the environment, et cetera, et cetera. We've already sort of talked about that. What are some of the other examples that we've talked about? Does anybody remember? What are some other complex organisms in the functional intermediates that we talked about? Anyone? Birds, or we fit with feathers and wings, right? And we talked about feathers as being functional intermediates. We've talked about wings itself as being some of the functional intermediates. And so since we've already discussed that, we're not here in this chapter, we kind of discuss those things again, but we'll just sort of cruise through those. Okay, lots of historical examples. Even the giraffe's neck, if you look there at the bottom in the 1890s, Herbert Spencer, he argued that an increase in the length of the giraffe's neck would require this independent, simultaneous changes in lots of stuff. You can't just you're not just going to have one mutation that makes your neck a little bit longer, right? Because there's a lot of different components that go into making your neck longer, right? You'd have to increase the length of your nerves, your bones, your muscles, etc., etc. We now know part of the answer to this question is that we have developmental genes, right, like the Hox genes and things like that, where in the developing of the embryo, these things something like length can be somewhat controlled by some of these developmental genes, right? So with regards to the eye, one of the problems, or one of the issues that Darwin seemed to spend a lot of time addressing, what we have to have these, the separate evolution of the lens, the retina, the pupil, etc. And again, like I mentioned before, what is the use of having 10% of an eye? And so we've already kind of looked at that. We're just going to show you again. Actually, but again, we say, okay, there's these functional intermediates. Okay, that's sort of the first part of that chapter, is sort of addressing those sort of things. We've already kind of addressed it. How can we get these complex adaptations? Before, though, this is an active link. This is still a really good sort of link that I want you to go to, where it kind of goes through the evolution of the eye. And so this will just, this is the second time we're getting back to this topic, but I don't think I had this link to the video in the earlier PowerPoint. Is that right? Does anybody remember seeing this video? I don't think so. So definitely go check that out. Okay. So, 140 years after Darwin first started discussing the human eye, do you think we hear much about the evolution of complex characters or not? You think, there's some, like for instance, the immune system, the immune response. This is a coordinated effort of lots of different cells and things like that. That has also been used to argue, that this notion of irreducible complexity. But the human eye, that argument, you don't hear about the human eye very much, right? That's usually not used because scientists have come up with a fairly good hypothesis about how you could have those functional intermediates. You don't really hear much about flight as one, but historically, what happens is you have one, and then somebody talks about one like the eye or like flight, and then scientists go through, and it takes a while to come up to sort of discover a good mechanism for that. And then once that's there, does that answer the question? know what seems to happen? People just just come up with something new, and then there's some good answers for that, and they come up with something new, and so it's sort of this almost conveyor belt type thing, and so there's going to be more, right? You're probably going to hear more later on, and it's more of a device really that a lot of creationists use to just sort of get you to doubt this, or not you necessarily, because you're science students and you've dealt with these things, but just to get the general, just to put a chink in the armor, right, of evolution in the public's eye. None of this stuff is none of this stuff has really changed, but the thing that has changed is just the exact example, and there's still another. Years ago, there was one that was addressed in Darwin's Black Box. Michael Behe, he wrote that, and he talked about the irreducible complexity of the flagellum, right? This outboard motor that bacteria have. And a lot of this stuff is coming from the Discovery Institute, which is an organization that you've probably heard of, possibly in the news. It's out of the state of Washington. And so really the examples change and the name has changed, right? Those of you who saw the video Intelligent Design on Trial, or Darwin, what was it? The one about the Dover case. Did you watch in 1120? What was the name of that one? Darwin? No.
It was something on trial.
Yeah, Intelligent Design on Trial. Or no. Anyway, gosh, I can't remember. But anyway, Michael Behe was one of the witnesses in that. So he was one of the witnesses in that. He, in the early 2000s, he came up with the Darwin's Black Box, arguing for this irreducible complexity, using the flagellum as an example. And so you have all of these different books. Here's another book, Icons of Evolution, by Jonathan Wells. You will continue to have a lot of these books coming out, and they just sort of reformulate or rebrand these arguments, right? Not really reformulate, they just sort of rebrand these arguments with a new example. But in the end, it's all, this is something that has been thought about and being discussed and being answered for 100 plus years now. Okay, Behe. I'm not sure. Behe is not that active, and Behe, even though he became that book, the Darwin's Black Box, became one of the main creationist books, and creationists love to sort of use it, right? Behe himself, when I was in grad school, I emailed back and forth with him a bit, and he actually, and I asked him one time, I said, so, because he's saying, this irreducible complexity or intelligent design, right? He's sort of a proponent of intelligent design, but then I asked him about, humans and chimps having common ancestors, and he was like, no, I'm not, I wouldn't have a problem with that. And so that's like sort of heresy among the creationists, because that's what that's where it all kind of gets down to, humans and chimps having common ancestor, but he wasn't totally in line with the sort of creationist movement on that point. Jonathan Wells is another really interesting individual. He was a Mooney. Does everybody remember the Moonies? It's a religious group where they have these mass weddings. They had a leader, sort of a charismatic leader from Korea. Nobody remembers the Moonies. Anyways, he was a Mooney and a religious person that then went back to grad school to get a PhD in biochemistry with the specific design to try to get that degree and then come back and say, look, I'm a scientist and this is the problems I have with evolution. But he was completely committed to being anti-evolution before he even started graduate school. He wrote this book, Icons of Evolution. And I even have a signed copy of that book because my sister-in-law was the publicist for it. And so she's like, I'll get him a signed copy. So anyway, so I have a signed copy of it from Jonathan Wells. Supposedly a nice guy, but same thing. It's just sort of this repackaging of these arguments. And if you read enough creationist literature, like I don't do it as much in grad school and post-grad school, I read a lot of it, right? You see sort of this pattern. And this irreducible complexity is something that you probably will see again, but just know it's it's nothing really new. Okay, and it all has to do with adaptation. Okay. All right, so we've already kind of talked about this, pre-adaptations, functional intermediates, that you have structures that happen to evolve a new function, even though the previous function wasn't necessarily completely in line or the same function as the new one. So for instance, bird feathers being thermoregulation, being the function as thermoregulators or helping in thermoregulation before they functioned, provided their function for flight, right? You have, so here at Acanthostega, these are sort of this transition from the marine environment to the terrestrial environment, and the limbs, sort of the early evolution of the more robust, going from lobe fins to limbs, where it wasn't exactly used in the beginning with Acanthostega. It's not necessarily being used to walk around on land, right? But the functional intermediate, or the pre-adaptation, is it was kind of using it to propel itself around in shallow water, right? And then as it began to be more robust, evolve a more robust structure, eventually this is leading to sort of that transition. Too much about that because we have already talked a whole bunch about it. Okay, so let's just go back about testing adaptation. So when we're looking at adaptations, we look at something like the giraffe's neck, and we say, oh, okay, we can make a hypothesis, right, about, okay, why does the giraffe have a long neck? Oh, we see this giraffe over here, and it's reaching up, and it's grabbing the leaves, and then you see a shorter giraffe and saying, oh, it's reaching up and it's not able to grab those same leaves that are as high up on the tree as we think. It's not as, it can't reach as high, so that's obviously what that is, quote unquote, adapted for. And so we go out into nature and we see these things and we can say, okay, this is cool, this is probably what it's adapted for. But as evolutionary biologists, we can't just go out and say that. We can't just say, okay, end of story, giraffes have long necks, they feed on leaves, trees are tall, therefore that's why giraffes have long necks, is because of because they feed in trees. We have to go through and actually formulate a hypothesis, right, and test it. So this hypothesis that giraffes have long necks because they feed on leaves high up in trees, we could make a hypothesis about that. So what could we hypothesize? We could hypothesize that giraffes should spend most of their time foraging sort of up above their competitors, right? Because they're the only ones that can reach that. And it makes logical sense to us, but we still have to go out. Researchers have done. And so they went and they looked and they decided, okay, we're going to look at the amount of time that male and female giraffes, males have longer necks than female giraffes, they spend feeding, and what we see is that they don't actually, where they can reach all the way up, if you look 5 meters plus, where they're not going to have as many competitors, are they feeding up there at 5 meters plus most of the time? If you look there, the sort of y-axis, that shows you the amount of time or the fraction of their feeding that they're feeding at different places. But what do you see? These really tall giraffes, they're even feeding all the way down there at 1 meter above the ground. And where are they feeding most of the time for females? If you had to, kind of give an average. Yeah, so like 2.5. So that's like, 6 feet high, 6, 7 feet high. So it's not really that. So this actually is then, when we go out to test this adaptation, it's telling us, wait a second, maybe giraffes, maybe that this assumption that we had isn't necessarily true. With males, you see, okay, between 3 and 4, maybe 4 meters would be it. And so then we have to incorporate this new data, and we say, wait a second, maybe long necks. And in the 90s, a couple of researchers began to suggest that actually the giraffe's neck wasn't necessarily an adaptation for feeding high up. Does that mean that they can? Yeah, and they do, right? They feed at plus 6 meters or whatever. But what they found is that it had evolved, or what they suggested is that it had actually evolved as a weapon used with males when competing for access to females. And so they used them sort of as this battering ram. And what we saw is that males have longer and thicker necks than females, and skulls, and this was sort of a big piece of information, that were 3.5 times heavier. So you have the giraffe neck, has this big long neck. You kind of think of it as like, a battering ram or something. And then you have this big, heavy, thick head on the back of it. And then you see here males competing with each other to have access to females. And so actually it became more of a selective or sexual selection than actually a adaptation for females. Okay, so that just illustrates the need to actually go out there, not just have the hypothesis and say, okay, this sounds good, because in evolutionary biology, a lot of times that's where it starts out, right? It's this observational thing, and then you have to, in your mind, make a, sort of this scenario of how it could happen. And sometimes it seems very, very logical and straightforward, almost to the point that it's like, what's the point of actually going out and raising the money and doing these experiments to actually showing that, because it seems so logical, but we have to do that. We can't just assume that. And the giraffe is a really great example of that. So when we go out there and we study adaptation, we generally do it in a number of different ways. There's 3 principal ways that we can study adaptation. The first one is we can do experiments. So a really good example of, studying behavioral or morphological adaptations is a study, and it's kind of a cool study, with taffeted flies, okay? They are interesting because when they are disturbed, right, when they're threatened, what they do is they hold up their wings perpendicular, and they wave them kind of around. It's almost like they hold up their wings and they just start like waving like crazy their wings. And so scientists saw that behavior and they said, okay, maybe they are doing that to mimic the legs of jumping spiders. So these flies occur in symmetry with these spiders, and so that was a hypothesis, all right? So sounds pretty good. Why else would a fly feel threatened and just sort of like wave its wings up like that? And then they also looked at the morphology and the coloration of the wings. It wouldn't do you any good if they were sort of transparent, right? But in fact, you see with the taffeted flies that they have these stripes in them, and it kind of looks like the same sort of behavior that jumping spiders do. Okay, so you have to, when possible, what you want to do is you want to frame that put that into the framework of hypothesis testing. So one hypothesis would be flies do not mimic jumping spiders, right? Another hypothesis would be that flies mimic jumping spiders in order to deter other predators. So not just jumping spiders prey on these flies, but there's other predators too. And so maybe they want to confuse those other predators into thinking that, oh, that's really not a fly, right? That's really a jumping spider. I better avoid that. And the third one would be that the flies are mimicking the jumping spiders to deter an attack from a jumping spider itself. Okay, so we've framed it. We've been very specific about, okay, how are we going to test this? I mean, we have 3 very specific hypotheses. Now we have to say, okay, how could we, through this experimental method, test that? What would you do? How would you design an experiment to test that? This is the hard part, right?
For the third one, you just put them in the same area with jumping spiders and see what happens.
So, but how would you test what's happening? How would you have a control or a variable? What would be your variable in that experimental set? You put them in there, and the fact that jumping spiders, eat, and they already knew that they eat taffeted flies sometimes, but does that answer what they're doing with their wings or not? You have to tease apart this action with their wings with no action with their wings, right? How are you going to do that?
Damage their wings.
Yeah, chop off their wings, right? Okay, so you can set up an experiment, where you can, not necessarily you could chop them off, but you could also chop them off and replace them with what? something like Drosophila wings. Exactly what they did with the experiment. And so they had these 5 different categories. They had the flies that were untreated, and you can see the flies, the tephretid flies, lifting up their banded wings, right? In A, that's just the normal one, right? The purpose of this was to just basically test the effect of the wing markings, plus the behavior of the wing waving. The second one they did was they cut off the wings and then they glued them back together. Okay, this was just sort of a control for the effect of what happens when you cut off a fly's wings and then do something with it. The third one is more interesting, right? This is where they cut off the wings and then they replaced the wings. It wasn't with the housefly wings, so it wasn't Drosophila. It was what's the black housefly? What's the species name? I forgot what. It's a Drosophila melanogaster. Okay, so with Drosophila melanogaster. So in that one, what are they doing? They're separating out the banding, the behavior. So this fly, when it feels threatened, is still going to go through its behavior that's sort of ingrained, right? But now it has a clear wing, and so now you're going to be able to test. Okay, does that deter the predator or not? Number D is also an interesting one. Take the housefly, and what do you do to the housefly? You cut off its wing, and you replace it with the tephretid, the banded wings, and then the last one is an untreated housefly. And so you have all of these different sort of scenarios, very well designed experiment to see exactly what happens. And in this way, by doing this now through the method, we can make predictions about what we would predict would result based on our hypothesis. So the hypothesis 1 was no mimicry. So what should happen in each of these cases? They should all be attacked, right? Number 2, mimicry deters other predators. So in this situation, each of those categories, when exposed to a jumping spider, the jumping spider should attack, right? Because it has nothing to do with deterring a jumping spider. But the other predators in category A and B should retreat, right? Because both of those, are mimicking the jumping spider. So what are they doing? They are telling basically other predators that I'm a jumping fly or a jumping spider, and so then they don't attack. And then the third one, you would see, okay, they all get attacked, right? And really, we're mostly just looking at A and B, right? Because those are sort of the ones that we're trying. That's what we're trying to test. And the jumping spiders should retreat in that case if the function of that behavioral and morphological adaptation was to deter the attack of jumping spiders. And so, in an experimental way, and what we end up finding is, in fact, here we have the jumping spider responses, right? And these are just different kinds of responses of an attack. They can kill them, they can stalk and attack them, or they can retreat. And with all of the different categories, what do we see? For instance, at the very top, just looking at the very top, how would you interpret that graph? What's happening? What is the adaptive function of those wings based on these data? What would you say? What's that? So mimicking jumping spiders, but we're testing jumping spiders. Deter jumping spiders. You said, yeah. So they're not mimicking it. They're basically, maybe they are. Oh, you're right. Maybe they're mimicking it, but this is good experimental evidence that suggests that, in fact, what they originally thought, that the tephretid flies were using their wings, right, to deter the attacks of jumping spiders, right, by, sort of fooling the jumping spiders everywhere. Does it work all of the time? No, because you can see sometimes they get a lower percentage sometimes they do get killed, right, and but it does work some of the times to deter the attack from jumping spiders. So if you look at C, what is that telling you? Do they retreat? Not really. Do they still stalk and attack them? Yeah. Do they kill them? Yeah. What's that telling them? Yeah, that both of these things are important. Not just the movement of the wings, but also the stripes on the wings are important. Nice example of experimental studies. Okay, second category is observational studies. Basically, we could say this is an observational study with Dipsosaurus, which is a desert iguana species we have here in southern Utah, and thermal regulation. We might say, okay, every time that we catch a desert iguana, we see that we measure the temperature, and we see that it has a temperature, somewhere around, between 30 and 40 degrees. We can say, oh wow, that's really interesting. How do they do that, or why is that? And we might say, okay, they have a behavioral adaptation to move into and out of the sun to thermal regulate to this sort of most efficient temperature. And that's what this graph is showing you. It's showing the most efficient, it's graphing like hearing efficiency, speed, what's the temperature that, because they're ectotherms, right? The temperature that they can escape, temperature that they digest the best, and then we can see, okay, here's this optimal temperature. So that might be our hypothesis about that adaptive behavior. But what we would have to do, right, is we would have to go out there and we would have to monitor their behavior and see if in fact, that's what they're doing. Monitor their temperature. When their temperature goes down, we'd have to show that they do things behaviorally. They have this behavior. We can also do that with garter snakes, and here are the results of an experiment that implanted snakes with radio transmitters, and so they could tell where they were at, and also these teletransmitters could measure their body temperature. And so they did that with a whole bunch of garter snakes, and they tried to answer the question, do these snakes do they make adaptive choices when they are looking for places to overnight, right? Because they still want to be close to that adaptive temperature. And so here you see, is there only one? I thought there had two. Oh, yeah. Okay, so basically they were able to see that the snakes were very good at keeping the temperature between the optimal thermal range. And what you see here is that first part, the temperature is in red, right? They're under a rock, and their temperature is gradually decreasing. Then when it gets to a certain, low sort of point at hour 9, right? Basically in the morning, and we see this, when we go out into the desert and we see lizards and things in the morning coming up, and what are they doing? They place themselves on the rocks so that they can heat up. That's exactly what the snakes were doing. They raise their temperature, they get kind of into that optimal range, and then they go back into the red where they go under a rock. They get a certain temperature, and then they go back under the rock where they maintain that same temperature, but being under the rock, it makes it so that they don't increase their temperature. And what else does it do? It helps protect them from possible. Okay. So here we have again a graph. This is that second graph that I was sort of telling you about. And what we see is that they have these behavioral options, and they have adapted behavior to moving in between sunny and shady areas, moving up and down burrows to thermal regulate.
That's 9:15.
Yeah, I know. I saw it. We got till 9:20.
Oh, that clock had
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We're almost done. Okay, so here, this is just a whole bunch of other data where they were looking at and really sort of in a sort of framework of strict observational studies where they could actually go through and confirm sort of their hypothesis. Okay, so based on their observation, researchers predicted that the best strategy would be for the garter snakes to retreat under medium-sized rocks at night. So based on, and I sort of jumped a little bit right there, but that's okay. So they made that prediction. So then they went through and further looked at their at these predictions where they different sized rocks, and they could see exactly where they were making choices. And so here in an environment, if you look up at the top, there's sort of an even distribution of the different rock sizes, right? Around 33%, a third of the rocks were thin, medium, and thick. And so are the snakes just choosing something based on close proximity, or are they actually selecting going under the medium rocks? And what do these data tell us? What do these observational data tell us? Based on the hypothesis, they are actually choosing the medium rocks. Quick question, since we only have 3 minutes.
I don't think so, but does it say what's considered a medium?
It's in there. I don't know what it was. They had to have obviously sort of, had some sort of cutoff point of what a medium-sized rock was. Okay, so we have 2 minutes to do the last method. This is the comparative method. This can be sort of the most technical one because we incorporate phylogenetic, sort of a phylogenetic investigation on it. The example that they do is with fruit bats, flying foxes, etc., species of the Megachioptera. And what they find is that some bats have relatively larger testes than other bats. And so what they wanted to find out is there a correlate? Why do they have these large testes? A lot of times when we see in other mammals, large testes are a result of sperm competition, meaning, several males have access to females to reproduce, and the male that is able to outproduce the actual amount of gametes, female gets fertilized by several males. The male that has the biggest investment, or the biggest, I'm trying not to sound crass, the biggest load of gametes, right, is going to outcompete the other ones. This is sperm competition. And so they wanted to look at bats that group up in large groups compared to small groups, and the bats that roost and gather in larger groups. Do the males have larger testes? Okay, is there sperm? And so what they wanted to do is they said, okay, let's look at group size, let's look at testes size, and in fact they got this positive correlation. So at sort of face value, that seems to say, okay, that's good proof of that. But what we find is that we have to take it even a step further, because in cases this may be a result of just a passed on characteristic from a common ancestor. So say for instance, group size ABC, the common ancestor down there at that node pointed out by the green arrow just happened to have small testes and not have large groups, right? And down there, the common ancestor of DEF, that characteristic was large testes, and it just got passed down through the common ancestor, not necessarily because they are roosting in large or small groups. There's a method that we can use. It's called Feldenstein's method of evaluating phylogenetically independent contrasts, and basically what it does is it teases apart these things by, if you look over there on the left, recreating ancestral states, right? S, R, T, U, going through, and we obviously don't have time to look at the details. Go through and actually tease those things apart. Felsenstein was a big name in early phylogenetic reconstruction. You can go through this comparative method and actually tease apart it being a characteristic that was just passed down from a common ancestor, as opposed to an adaptation situation. And this is the graph that it shows you that yes, in fact, when you pair up groups, just in general, a group that has large, a group that has small, you reconstruct the ancestral state. This tells us that yes, in fact, large testes are an adaptation that has arisen because of sperm competition among bats that group in large groups. Okay, so that one was, I didn't really do too much detail on that, but that's what that's telling us, and